The baby crept abroad to pluck a flower. One said yes, sir, one said maybe, one said wait the hour. Hi, welcome to this Cordus Conversation. Even the best of us occasionally have technical difficulties, and that seemed to happen in this case. So we're missing the first part of our conversation. I'm going to bring you up to date on what was going on before the conversation begins. My name is Rick Rosen. I'm the artistic director and founder of Cordus Mundi. We're going to be joined by our music director, Mr. Timothy Harrell, and we're thrilled and pleased to have with us composer Zachary Wadsworth. Zachary, I had a great introduction that I did for Zach that, of course, you're now not going to see, so I'll just very quickly let you know a little bit about Zach. Zach is an American-Canadian composer who has, according to the Washington Post, fresh, deeply felt, and strikingly original music. I think Cordus Mundi would agree with that. Zach's compositions include Out of the South Cometh the Whirlwind, Pictures of the Floating World, his opera Venus and Adonis, and of course Love's History, which is the piece that Zach wrote for Cordus Mundi that we commissioned from him to celebrate our 10th anniversary. That piece of music is on our CD. Very poorly putting in front of you. Now, there we go. Is on our latest CD, Cordus Mundi, Unforgettable. You'll find a great rendition of Love's History there. Zach is originally from Richmond, Virginia. We found, much to our amusement, that both Zach and Tim hail from Virginia. Zach has degrees from Eastman School of Music, Yale University, and Cornell University, and he is currently an assistant professor of music at Williams College. My goodness. So when we joined the conversation in progress, we had just started talking about Love's History, again, the composition that Cordus Mundi commissioned from Zach. The text is taken from George MacDonald, and that's the George that you'll hear Zach referring to. And I think we can take it from there. We will join this in process, and we apologize for the technical difficulties, but we hope you'll enjoy the conversation nonetheless. Thank you.
And with so many commissions, actually finding the text can be the longest and most complex part of the process. Because oftentimes you know what themes you're looking for, you know roughly what length of a poem you're looking for, but you just are then out and reading. And so I can sometimes be reading for a week, sometimes be reading for a few months to try to find the right thing. And I knew of George MacDonald's poetry because I had set another poem of his for a commission several years earlier from the Stanton Music Festival in Stanton, Virginia, and that piece was much more kind of fairy tale in its nature. And I had looked for a long time and found this poem that was very, very much a kind of fairy tale. And I just kept in the back of my mind that I really liked this poet who very few people had heard of. And I had just found a book of his on Google Books or something like that. And so I thought, well, maybe I should go back and see what else is in that big book that I only took one poem from a few years earlier, and found this poem, Love's History, which ties into ideas of love across a lifetime and aging and these kinds of themes that seem to really resonate with the idea of a choir celebrating an anniversary. And so, that all of these things led me to this text, and it also seemed kind of right in some ways for a men's chorus. I don't know how to describe exactly what I'm looking for when I'm writing for TTBB, but sometimes just poems seem to kind of have something that would work in that way.
I like that a lot. We've programmed a couple times pieces that were specifically written for boys choir or for youth choirs. And there's something kind of ironically neat and interesting about the juxtaposition of, shall we say, older men singing younger texts and pieces written, for younger voices. Tim, you chuckled.
Referring to older men, yeah.
Well,
I have a question while we're on this about you on your website or something. It talks about your being a tenor. So
That's great.
being a singer informs your composing quite a bit. And it was a comfortable piece for us to sing, but I'd love for you to talk more about that.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, long before I got kind of a late start with the music instruction in my life. I didn't really start officially studying music until I was 13 or
Mm.
so. But well before that, I mean, since I can really remember, since the age of 5 or 6, was singing in school choirs and really loving singing in choirs. And it's something that I've continued to do really my whole life and until recently. But I think in some ways it felt like a world that that I learned about from the inside. Being a choral singer, you learn how choral music works, and it's something that can be hard to teach without just telling someone join a choir. But I found that because I was singing in groups throughout high school, college, and after, because I was singing in groups, I was learning how singers rehearse, what singers like to dig into, what they don't like to dig into, and also learning about how text and music interact and enmesh with one another in really meaningful ways. And so I think for me it was I never really thought, oh, I want to become a choral composer per se, but it seemed like once I got out into the world as a composer, those were the circles in which I was moving. Those were my friends, those were my collaborators and my colleagues. And so singing in choirs really led to this life of writing vocal music and particularly choral music.
Well, as a singer, it really makes a difference, I think, when the composer sings,
Mm-hmm.
because
Yeah.
the different level of understanding what's sensible to expect the voice to do
Mm-hmm.
versus what some instrumental composers can demand from us, forgetting that we're wind instruments first.
Yeah, and also I think that that we're always listening and watching in ways that not every musician is. Like I think I like to think of writing for choirs not as like taking away difficulty per se from instrumental music, but rather just kind of trying to write for what I think choirs do really well, like the kinds of tuning that you can get in choirs and the kind of textures and dynamics. And I just think uh, so many, or I've heard in composer circles sometimes just a feeling of like, oh, it's frustrating to write for choirs because you have to take away so much or you have to strip down so much. And I don't really like to think of it that way, rather kind of starting from a place of like, what does the choir meaningfully do well, and what can choirs do that almost no other ensemble can do, and then build from there.
A related question. In another one of these conversations, well, let me back up and say this. I'm looking at my copy of Love's History, and I noticed that there are several places where Cordus Mundi would get to the end of a phrase and we would slow down to the point that Dave, who was conducting at that point, I have written in several times here, don't slow down. And so it was clearly something that, the choir wanted to do, the conductor wanted something different, and perhaps the composer wanted something even different than that. And the discussion we had in another conversation was, if the choir interprets differently than the composer, how does the composer feel about that?
Yeah, it's something that every composer needs to learn, I think, early on, is that, if we want absolute control over the result of the thing we're writing, ultimately we need to be writing computer music, and that's a great place to have that precision and that absolute control. But if we're thinking of the process of creation of music as really a truly collaboration between composer and performer and even audience to a certain extent, I think we have to enter into the process of rehearsal and performance with a kind of good giving and game quality. Like we in fact might not always know the best way for our pieces to go in performance. And I think that can be a difficult process for composers, because sometimes you think, oh, I really didn't mean that. And that's, that's why ideally composers come to rehearsals. But I think I always try to approach these kinds of situations with the sense of that it's actually, it's a wide spectrum of reasonable decisions about how to interpret a piece. And this ties in too to the fact that, I'm putting like marks on a page that are then meant to be read and interpreted. And that can go so many different directions, right? Like and even when I find myself performing my own music, I think, oh, I'm doing this like a good, 10 beats per minute slower than I marked it. Or, oh, I took time there and didn't put in a retardando, or things like that. So I do think inherently there are flaws to all notated music, and I try again to think of those as invitations and not like limitations of notated music.
So as a
I was just going to say, you'll pardon me if I write down invitations, not limitations. I'm sorry. Go right ahead, please.
in following up what you're saying, then I wonder, have you had many experiences where a performing, say, a conductor comes to you and says, "This is what we're intuitively doing. How do you feel about that?" Or have a collaboration and conversation about those things.
I think wherever something feels intuitive, I don't want to tinker too much with that. In part also because I think good choral music should feel intuitive. I think that's part of creating like singable lines, whatever that means. And it doesn't mean simple, but it means intuitive, right? So I think I'm always trying to find that place of intuition where something sounds like, oh, or this line kind of fits in my, not just in my voice, but like in my sense of what a line should be, right? And then to kind of jump off from there, to build within that space, like so that nothing is impossible, nothing is counter to that sense of intuition. Some things might stretch it and feel a little like, ooh, what's, I wasn't expecting that, or things like that. That can actually be kind of fun to play with. But I think wherever someone comes to me and says, we intuitively want to do this or that, it is a good thing. I think to me, it means that they kind of felt a connection to what the piece wanted to be and do. They were reading into the kind of deeper musicality, hopefully, of the piece, and then interpreting it. So I almost never want to say like, oh, your intuition's wrong. Just because often then it's like saying, I think then it's my fault, essentially. It means that the gestures aren't intuitive.
Well, it still sounds like we're going back to what we were talking about earlier. You're a vocalist and you understand that freedom that we as singers need, that instrumentalists don't have the same desire. That's a great feeling as a performer to.
Yeah, and to have something that you can really dig into, and it's hard to describe because performers of instrumental music also often have a vocal approach. One of my good friends and collaborators, Roger Rowe, who's an oboist, really approaches playing the oboe like a singer approaches singing, and so I think in so many ways we're all thinking of music in similar ways, but the means, as you say, are different, right? And I think in that singers are always connected to breath, and that choral singers are always kind of scanning up and down the score and part of a community and listening and responding and tuning to each other in a really free way. I think there is something really special to that.
Oh, I like beautiful images, beautiful images. So what you been doing?
Yeah, it's this pandemic has turned everything upside down for everyone, I'm sure. But I've been keeping busy. I mean, up until the pandemic started, I was very busy with commissions, and in fact, continue to be in some ways. I'm working with some performer friends and collaborators on some projects that are, I think, like everyone right now, just kind of throwing things at the wall and seeing what happens. But life has been busy since I was down with Cordus Mundi. I think the main project, I've become a composer in residence with a men's choir in Vancouver called Cor Leone. And that has involved quite a few new commissioned pieces for them. And the biggest of which was for the 100th anniversary of the armistice that ended World War I. So for this, I wrote like an evening length kind of men's chorus, soloist, string quartet, percussionists kind of longer piece that was then recorded and released, called When There Is Peace. And that was the biggest project in the last few years in terms of just size and length. But otherwise, you know, it's a mixture of composing and teaching, and it's been a really nice blend of those two things: solitary work and social work, or more. I shouldn't call teaching social work. Work that is social in its nature, putting me in touch with humans and not just my piano and a piece of manuscript paper.
How are you finding being a professor?
It's great. I mean, I feel very lucky to be teaching at Williams College. My students there are extremely bright and extremely curious and extremely talented. And, you know, if I say read this book, they read the book. And, you know, if I say watch this thing, they watch the thing or listen to the thing. So it's really rewarding to work with really motivated students there. And I do find also it's really helped me kind of or understand how to kind of quickly talk about certain musical concepts that I might have had a hard time talking about otherwise, because I'm having to communicate them to students in quick lessons and things like this. So I find I do start to come away with these kinds of musical compositional aphorisms and just kind of quick things that I can throw at them. Some of them are recycled from my own composition teachers, but it's definitely helped with that, just having to be able to kind of say what I think about music in very small numbers of words. So it's been great, in other words, I guess, to work at Williams.
And did we understand that there's something in a TTBB realm that we should be asking you about?
In terms of the
future folk songs.
Oh yeah, well, this was a piece I wrote last year. Yeah, thanks for asking. So this was another commission from Cor Leone in Vancouver. And this was, I mean, one of the perks, I guess, of being a composer in residence with a group is that you do gain familiarity over multiple projects with them. And this was a project where I really just abused my position by, I think they asked for a 6-minute piece and I gave them like a 15-minute piece or something. But I was sitting around and thinking about what to write. It was a wide open commission. And I've been, over the past few years in particular, and especially now that this pandemic has started, kind of thinking more about text in particular. And a lot of the pieces I've written have used very beautiful old public domain texts, and I've absolutely loved working with those texts. But I've also thought about the limitations of that and how, you know, how much can these texts speak to our experience now? How directly can they speak to our experience now? And anyway, so just one afternoon while I was trying to kind of think, okay, what do I really want to be thinking about? The thought came into my mind, like, well, what might someone in the future sing a folk song about? So that resulted in this set of speculative folk songs called Future Folk Songs. And the trick here was finding texts, which I ended up writing myself because I didn't know where else to find them. But just thinking about what a future person might be singing about. So the first one that came to mind ended up being called Mountain Song. and it's about climate change, essentially. The song is about climate change, and it's about two people going to the top of the mountain together to escape the rising waters, and singing a love song to each other about how they made it up the mountain together. So it's thinking about the mixture of kind of big, huge world events and the more personal stories, and trying to find those conversations in a piece. Other ones are a little more funny. There's one that's like a lullaby where a parent is telling their child to turn off their digital screen device or whatever. So it was a really fun piece to write, and I think challenged me to think about text again in really different ways from some earlier pieces.
You raised an interesting side point. Back to a musical question specifically. Do you find that as you get to know the members of Corleone, do you find that you're writing in any way that you're writing for those specific voices?
I think so, and for those brains too. I mean, there are things about voices that you just learn when you write for a choir once, and you say, oh, they can do that really well. I mean, I know, for example, like after writing a few pieces with Corleone, they can, because they're a really large group, in part, they can do these really soft, really high, and really low things that then I started doing more of. But the writing for their brains thing was something that I hadn't anticipated as much. But just conversations, like, you know, over beers after a premiere, having conversations about, well, what do we think choral music should be doing? That's actually in part where the idea for future folk songs came from, or I think where the seed was planted, is some people saying, what does it mean to be singing in a choir nowadays? What should we be using our stage and our voices to communicate to audiences? How can we not just inspire from a place of beauty, but maybe even inspire someone to think critically about the world, or about their actions or their positions in the world? You know, this is a choir full of people who are thinking about that, and I think a conversation with them after a premiere of a more traditional piece led to think, okay, well, maybe this group actually is looking for something a little different, something more in conversation with now. And so that was a really neat experience, to be able to come back and write a second thing and a third thing. It's been a really nice setup.
Wow. Any thoughts about how we get from where we are until we get back on stage?
Gosh, I wish I knew. I mean, Tim, do you have thoughts about this? Or I think we're all questioning.
It's so frustrating to not be able to make music weekly in worship. And I talk to so many people who are appreciative of what we're trying to do, you know, online, but it is not the same. And I'm trying to remember as a performer to not be so selfish in thinking about how I can feed myself, because I'm not getting fed, but we're feeding others. So I guess that's the best we can do right now.
I insert into that Craig Hella Johnson's comment, which was that we have 12 to 15 months to get crazy creative.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think, if anything, if I'm thinking about how I want to be using this time, now that I've had a few commissions delayed and have a little bit of space, especially now that classes are ending at Williams for the semester, to think about what the future means. I've definitely been feeling that way. Like, maybe this is a time to actually not just think, oh, what's my next deadline? Oh no, but actually to think, where do I want to be going as an artist? And now maybe that's easier to say as a composer who's working whose work is almost always in isolation, right? Composers have to be pretty comfortable with this idea of distance if we want to get anything done. But I think for me as a choral singer, there is a sense of mourning, the sense of community and that feeling of togetherness, which are, of course, the very things that spread this disease. But yeah, I hope also a sense of how can we use this time to improve our own personal skills? How can we use this time to stay together as a community in a digital way? And how can we use this time to plan a bright future and a creative flourishing in the future once we can all kind of poke our heads back above the surface?
Amen. And in the meantime, one of the first goals is how can we all figure out how to do our virtual videos so that we're not all little tiny squares and we look like the Brady Bunch, right?
Exactly. We all need at-home green screens and video technicians so we can have better better virtual gatherings.
But I think there is a neat point here, which is that even those of us that are getting pulled into the 21st century, dragging and kicking and screaming, but we're learning, you know, we're adapting our skill sets, right, in order to survive and in order to make music in some forms. I think this is part of what we need to do, right?
Yeah, I think that's right. I think in so many ways it's a way of not admitting defeat, right?
Amen. We'll be all right. We'll be all right.
We
And we're
will.
going to come back with passion that we never knew we had for making music, I think. I think that's going to be part of it.
Yeah, I keep thinking about what those first chords are going to feel like when we're back in choirs. I think it's going to reaffirm all the love that brought us into choirs in the first place.
I think it's going to be hard to make the decision on the first hymn on that first Sunday when we really can sing. What is that going to be?
That's right.
And are we even going to be able to sing? Because I'll be bawling. I'll be crying.
Yeah.
No.
Yeah.
People won't see my face. My back is to everybody except the choir, but I know.
Yeah, definitely.
Well, I can't think of anything that's going to top this part of this conversation we've just had, unless either of you gentlemen have anything you want to add here. Zach, it's been an absolute pleasure.
Thanks so much for having me. It's been really wonderful to reconnect and to talk.
So is the Corleone piece you described to us, are the folk songs available for us to sing yet?
I'll send them along. Yes. Email is still up and running, I guess, isn't it? So
We'd love to look at that.
great.
Yeah.
Well, gentlemen, it's been more than wonderful. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye.
Steve, bye-bye.
you. Bye.